souls to the crusade, a ticket directly to heaven.
For those of you who once fought against brother and relative, now rightfully fight against the barbarians. Know then that whoever sets out on this journey not out of lust for worldly advantage, but only for salvation of his soul and liberation of the church, is remitted in entirety all penance for his sins.
Pope Urban marketed the crusade brilliantly. He struck a number of chords that the knights of Western Europe wanted to hear. He said, look, you're living these violent lives. If you don't atone for your sins, you're going to go to hell. What the crusade offered was a way of carrying on fighting and also receiving a spiritual reward. That was the deal. If you went on crusade, you got the remission of all your sins. You would not go to hell.
The Pope's sermon pushed the boundaries of Christian teaching. In his holy war, a crusader now had the blessing of God to ignore the sixth commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," as long as he was an infidel.
This is violence which God actually wants, and he wants it so much that he's actually going to give a spiritual reward to people who participate in it. It's literally like opening Pandora's box. I'm not sure he's actually conscious of how dangerous an idea he's tampering with at Clermont. But what it leads to is a very powerful upsurge of a sense of hatred of the outsider, if you like, in Western Europe, and a turning against anyone who seems to be other than what is an accepted norm, a Western Christian.
Before the crusade had even left Europe, Christian fanatics swept up by the Pope's words hankered to spill blood. To these fundamentalists, any non-Christian was an infidel, and the infidels were all around.
But the pilgrims rose up in a spirit of cruelty against the Jews. They inflicted a most cruel slaughter on them, claiming that the killings would be of service against the enemies of Christianity. They attacked them, decapitated many. They destroyed their homes and synagogues, and even divided all the looted money amongst themselves.
Across Europe, thousands of Jews were massacred in the name of God. Murder and slaughter of the innocent had become the hallmarks of the First Crusade. In the autumn of 1096, almost a year after the Pope's sermon, armies from France, Germany, and Italy set out on the epic 3,000-mile march to aid their Christian brothers and liberate the Holy Land from Muslim rule. At the helm of the largest army from Northern Europe was Duke Godfrey of Bouillon.
Godfrey was one of the senior leaders of the First Crusade. He was a very pious man. In fact, we know that he brought a number of monks with him on the expedition to help him in his daily prayers. He was also a great warrior. He'd won repute before the Crusade for his feats in single combat, and he was a respected man who the leaders of the expedition felt they could all deal with.
At Godfrey's side was his younger brother Baldwin, the Count of Boulogne. Ruthless to the core, Baldwin had once been destined for the priesthood, but had turned instead to a love of women and war.
Writers talk about him being plagued by lust and the sins of the flesh. We said to be quite discreet about all of this, but it is an aspect of his character. He's also a very pragmatic man, and somebody who would not hesitate to brush aside others if they crossed him.
Following in the footsteps of Duke Godfrey and Count Baldwin, military historian John France uses 11th century sources as his guidebook. These medieval records reveal the harsh realities of life on crusade.
To take the cross must have been very, very expensive. We know that people sold land, we know that they mortgaged land. They seem to have tried to raise about 6 years' income just to live through the crusade. A rich man would have had a whole retinue. He'd have come, with his household, with everybody who would normally accompany him. And possibly wives. It's often forgotten that many wives came with their husbands because they too were inspired by this remarkable opportunity for salvation. So what you have on the crusade is a sort of city, as a whole society, moving eastwards towards Jerusalem. The problems of feeding that are absolutely immense. I mean, it is almost inconceivable how they did it. We would guess that they stole stuff, but fundamentally they were probably buying from the local peasants who would be glad to sell, but at very high prices.
For almost 6 months, Godfrey's Crusader army lumbered across thousands of miles, over the rivers and mountain ranges of Eastern Europe. They finally joined forces with other Christian armies from the south at the agreed rendezvous point, the spiritual heart of Eastern Christianity, Constantinople. Constantinople is today known as Istanbul, the bustling showpiece of modern Turkey, and a largely Muslim city. But 900 years ago, perched on the most easterly tip of Europe, it was the last Christian city before the Crusade ventured across the Bosphorus into enemy territory. Then, the jewel of the city was the great Orthodox Christian cathedral of St. Sophia. Covered in mosaics of burnished gold, it was a vivid testament to the legendary wealth of Constantinople. But the Crusaders would scarcely get a glimpse of it. The Byzantine capital was surrounded by 2 concentric rings of thick stone wall, more than 10 miles round and 30 feet high. To friends of his realm, the emperor would throw open the triumphal gates and usher them into the heart of his city. But to the mass of crusaders, they remained firmly closed.
Well, here are the remains of the magnificent Golden Gate, one of the 10 entrances to the city of Constantinople. This was originally a triumphal arch. You can see the 3 elements of the arch here. It reminds one a little bit of the Arc de Triomphe. Atop this structure, you would have had 4 bronze elephants, and around it there would have been a series of friezes depicting the deeds of the classical heroes of antiquity. When the Crusaders arrived out here, these doors would have been shining and dazzling, and of course closed before them.
The gates had been sealed on direct orders of the Emperor Alexius. He was furious. A Catholic army of 60,000 was not what he had in mind when he asked Pope Urban to send an elite team of mercenaries.
What he required was a group of about 300 knights, well-trained, well-armed, that he could direct where he felt the threat was greatest. What he got was something completely different, something that he did not remotely in his wildest dreams expect to receive. Tens of thousands of fanatical, armed men who descended upon him like a series of pests, locusts coming down, in fact, is how one chronicler describes it. And they came down and they approached his great city, wave after wave after wave.
The swarm of soldiers sent by his rival, the Pope, and now camping outside the gates, was large enough to mount an attack on the city. He couldn't afford to offend them. But Alexius could see a way to manipulate events to his own advantage.
The Emperor Alexius was a wicked and crafty man. He played the part of a scorpion, which when met face to face is harmless, but the tail of which is barbed with a poisonous sting it is well to avoid.
the emperor invited the principal commanders of the crusade into his lair, the inner sanctum of the imperial palace. Alexius was confident he could win over Duke Godfrey and his brother Baldwin. But they had now been joined by another crusade commander. Raymond of Taranto was the aggressive eldest son of a family of Norman mercenaries who had recently taken control of southern Italy.
He was somebody who attracted attention through his appearance and through his bearing. He was perhaps the greatest warrior of the whole expedition. He was said to have the ferocity of a lion, a starving lion, charging into a group of sheep.
Bohemond's experience in war was invaluable. He had already battled against the Muslims in Sicily and won. But for years, he had also been fighting with the Byzantines. But Bohemond, like the other Crusader leaders, was a better soldier than a politician. They were all about to be outwitted.
When the emperor heard that Bohemond, that most distinguished man, had arrived, he ordered for him to be received with proper ceremony. Then, once he'd settled in, with the Duke Godfrey and his brother Baldwin, he invited him to a secret conference. He planned how to entrap these Christian knights by fraud and cunning.
Alexius had lost much of his empire to the Turks. He wanted to win these lands back, not see them passed on to this rival Catholic army. The emperor still had one trump card up his sleeve.
When they are in his lands, the one thing that they need is food. They're an army that is unprepared. It doesn't have supply chains like modern armies do. It's not all planned out ahead. They've got to live off the land. So Alexius can control and give them markets if they play the game. If they don't play the game with him, then he can withdraw those markets, and they are going to start suffering quite badly. It may provoke an outburst of bad behavior from them. They might start trying to ravage the land, but they realize sooner or later, because he has all the food, they've got to start doing business with Alexius. He knows that, and they know it too.
In return for his promise to supply food, each of the three Crusader leaders was forced to swear an oath of allegiance to the emperor. By that oath, they granted Alexius a commanding role over the whole campaign and vowed to return to his empire and the Eastern Orthodox Church any lands that they might win back from the Turks. The entire Crusader army was ferried across the Bosphorus by their new partners, the Byzantines. Soon they would be in enemy territory for the first time, and this fragile alliance would be put to the test. With Constantinople behind them, the Crusaders still had over 1,000 miles of hostile territory to cross before they reached Jerusalem. After only a few weeks, in May 1097, they reached the first enemy-held city. Nicaea, today known as Iznik, had once been a Byzantine city. But 20 years earlier, it had been seized by Turkish warlords and was now the fortress capital of the new Sultan, Kilij Arslan.
Over the northern hills is where the Crusader army came from. They marched down from Constantinople, over the hills, and fanned out round the city, clamping it in an iron siege. Finally, the moment of conflict. And they must have been pretty excited, pretty hepped up. This was the enemy. This is where it's...
Souls to the crusade, a ticket directly to heaven.
For those of you who once fought against brother and relative, now rightfully fight against the barbarians. Know then that whoever sets out on this journey, not out of lust for worldly advantage, but only
lives, if you don't atone for your sins, you're going to go to hell. What the crusade offered was a way of carrying on fighting and also receiving a spiritual reward. That was the deal. If you went on crusade, you got the remission of all your sins. You would not go to hell.
The Pope's sermon pushed the boundaries of Christian teaching.
Only for salvation of his soul and liberation of the church is remitted in entirety all penance for his sins.
Pope Urban marketed the crusade brilliantly. He struck a number of chords that the knights of Western Europe wanted to hear. He said, look, you're living these violent...
It's literally like opening Pandora's box. I'm not sure he's actually conscious of how dangerous an idea he's tampering with at Clermont. But what it leads to is a very powerful upsurge of a sense of hatred of the outsider, if you like, in Western Europe, and a turning against any...
In his holy war, a crusader now had the blessing of God to ignore the sixth commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," as long as he was an infidel.
This is violence which God actually wants, and he wants it so much that he's actually going to give a spiritual reward to people who participate.